My MQTT payloads. I want to talk really quickly about Home Assistant in a smart home project that I did recently, actually over the last year. So first of all, we're just going to dive right in. Home Assistant is absolutely garbage software that does incredible things, kind of like Python. If MacGyver had sex with Python, Home Assistant is what would pop out. I wish someone would make a purely declarative version of Home Assistant that does everything through MQTT, because MQTT, I learned, is an absolutely based protocol when it comes to home automation. And it's the only thing I ever want to touch if I ever do a project like this again. And most things, there's a way to get it to communicate through MQTT. So let's talk about how I ran Home Assistant. So I used Docker on Mac OS. What I did is I took an old iMac 27-inch and shoved it in the corner. Now, I named it Baby because nobody puts Baby in a corner, but I put Baby in a corner, and I installed Docker Desktop on Baby, which is also the worst piece of shit software on the planet. My containers worked differently on first launch compared to restarting them afterwards. I looked through all the documentation. I could not figure anything out. The only thing I could do was create a post-launch script to relaunch everything after my computer started in order to get it to work reliably. So what I will say is that the hardware itself, I had to set it up so that it restarted when the power was turned on. It was set up to auto log in to my user, and I used LaunchD to make sure that everything was working properly. And I had to set up Docker to automatically start. Now you'll see over here in the corner, we've got the power cord to the actual iMac. And what I will say is that setting up this hardware so that you can literally rip that cord out and plug it back in and have everything boot up properly was the best, the most killer feature in this whole setup. Because if you have a non-technical spouse or partner who has to deal with the stuff and you're not at home and they say, hey, the lights aren't working, then you can say, okay, great. Why don't you just go unplug that thing and plug it back in? And if it doesn't work, the whole thing's cursed, and it would take me hours to figure out anyway. So that is definitely a thing that I would always do, probably do first if you can. Now, let's talk about the integrations I used. So I did a Zigbee plus Wi-Fi build. And so for Zigbee, you can use USB or network Zigbee coordinators. I use a network one. I will never use USB. I tried a few USB ones. What I will say is Docker on Mac OS doesn't work with USB controllers, and outside of Docker, I found them to be very unreliable. Now, the network coordinator from tubezb.com is absolutely Chad hardware. It is literally the only thing that did not break during this entire project. My Wi-Fi router broke more times than that did. Now, let's talk about Wi-Fi. So when I first set up the Wi-Fi, I was worried about Wi-Fi soup having all these devices on. And I didn't get into like the hundreds of devices. I'd say I got into like the tens, maybe dozens. And all I'm going to say is just embrace the soup. Now, when it came to the Wi-Fi stuff, the Shelly Wi-Fi switches were my absolute favorite. That is also totally based hardware because you plug it in or you hook it up to DC or AC voltage. It turns on, it creates an AP, you connect to it, you can turn on MQTT mode and give it a network address and password to connect to. It starts up, it starts yeeting MQTT payloads into Mosquito. You can see them in any language. You can start building out integrations, and it's just awesome. So those Shelly Wi-Fi switches are incredible. Now, what did I use that for? I used that for my heat recovery ventilator. And part of that heat recovery ventilator system is we wanted to add a poop button. So now we have a poop button in both the master bath and the guest bath. And so if you have to poop, you press the poop button and it turns on the heat recovery ventilator for 30 minutes. Now, the problem with the poop button is it made us discover that the ventilation in the bathroom through the HRV was actually pretty terrible. So we're probably going to have to go into the attic and dig around to resolve that problem, or hire somebody to come out and dig around for us. Now, back to the declarative nature of this. Since Home Assistant isn't declarative, you have to schedule a turn off if you want something to run for like 30 minutes. So basically what you do is you say, hey, Home Assistant, turn on, and then 30 minutes from now, run a command that says turn off. So you can imagine that if the thing like goes down and then it comes back up, then the whole thing's like all jacked up. It doesn't work. We ended up having problems with this thing not working all the time. And if you need like ands, ors from multiple things trying to run this, like you've got your ventilation script that's 30 minutes and then somebody wants to override it, it gets really complicated and it just breaks all the time. And when it's not working right, it wastes energy, which is stupid. So the whole thing was basically kind of trash. Now let's get into network integration. So we actually used Hue through a network integration using the Hue bridge because the Hue app is just incredible. And if I'm being honest with you, lighting is probably 98% of the benefit you get from this stuff. And the Hue app is just really, really, really good. And anything that Home Assistant provides is just absolute trash in comparison. So I would just keep using Hue. Now, the bulbs, the Hue bulbs work really great. The Hue product system and products is just really amazing. But it's interesting. I was just checking Home Assistant and my Hue bulbs aren't working. So I'm gonna have to figure out why they're not working right now. But most of the time I didn't really care because they worked through the Hue app. Now, one thing I will say I added was an integration to Elgato with this Hue switch. And what that does is it turns on and off my lighting, my camera lighting. And this is probably the thing that I use the most of all the Home Assistant stuff that I'm going to talk about today. This is the thing I use the most, and it's fucking great. Now, what I will say is that I did set up NOAA Tide integration. So I use that for kayaking, but I only really use it 3 months out of the year, and then I kind of forgot about it. So that was kind of cool, but like really the value is pretty low. Plus, I got the Apple Watch now, and you can get all that stuff on there anyway. So now let's talk about the Zigbee sensors that I did use. So we have Aqara temp sensors everywhere. They work pretty great, but every now and then, again, they die. So what I do is I buy an extra one, and then when one dies, I swap the extra one in, and then I return my last one with Amazon, and I swap those out. So I always have one extra because they're just dying all the time. I don't know how they make money on these things if people are returning them all the time, but that's the case. And it's not just the battery. Like, they legit, the temperature sensor will just show 62 degrees Fahrenheit forever, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. I did add a water sensor by the fridge because our ice box fills up, and then it fills up and, you know, water starts to leak out and gets on the floor and it ruins the kitchen floor. But the interesting thing is, even though I set that up and it works great, we just ignore it just like we did before. And so it hasn't actually solved any problems for us. Another thing I did is I used smart plugs for fans to move heat around with the wood stove. And we're going to talk about the wood stove stuff because that was really important. The other thing we did with the Zigbee was we added a smart plug for the washer so we could tell when the washer was on or off. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in a second. Now, the other thing I did is I used a bunch of ESP hardware, custom ESP hardware. So ESP and ESP Home is just an incredible combo. And if you're thinking about doing custom hardware, I would skip Raspberry Pi. I would not even bother looking at it because ESP Home is basically this declarative YAML configuration file that generates all this ESP code. And the code that it generates is like, it works really well. The fact that it's declarative means you can go ahead and you can tweak it really easily and see that it's working or not working. And the stuff that you can do with that is actually like pretty mind blowing. You know, it's got MQTT built in. It's got tons of stuff built in. It's just a really awesome project. So you could not pay me to do this with a Raspberry Pi when I can use ESP Home. So that was a really nice discovery. But I used that. I used ESP and actually my own custom Dart controller for the wood stove. And the wood stove is using a linear actuator hooked up to an ESP controller with ESP Home. And that linear actuator literally opens and closes the damper on the wood stove. Now, I want to talk about this for a second because we live in a cold climate. And so we're heating with a wood stove like 6 months out of the year. And it actually saves us a ton of money. And what's really great is we're using like all local energy. So we don't have to like import oil and stuff like that, which is our alternative. So every now and then someone will come into my Twitter comments and be like, burning wood's bad for the environment. And all I'm going to say is like, just go fuck yourself, basically. That's all I'm going to say about that. But the thing is that controlling wood stoves is really difficult. So I had to build a custom PID algorithm for the wood stove. And I actually did that in Dart with MQTT. And that actually worked really great. It's on my GitHub if you want to see it. I also added Oh, and the reason why this is so important is because you can literally just throw wood in it and it keeps the temperature inside the stove constant. And it can change the set point high or low depending on what the temperature is in the basement, which means you won't like overheat or underheat. And it's really just like a total hack on how running a wood stove is. It's normally like a very involved process where you're down there every 30 minutes. You're basically babysitting it. This turned like a 30-minute check cadence into like a 3-hour check cadence. So that's like a 6x improvement on, how much time you have to spend looking at this thing, which is huge, as you can imagine. So, what else? Oh yeah, so laundry current sensor. Um, on the washer, because it's low current, mid current, 120 volt, I was able to use the Akara plug to actually tell if the washer was on or off. Then I used ESP. I used an ESP controller with ESP Home and one of those magnetic clamps to detect current on the dryer. And between those two things, I was able to set up an indicator in Home Assistant that basically said, is the dryer running? Is the washer running? Are they available? Like all that stuff. Oh, and availability was done through a door switch, a car door window switch. Now, one thing that was kind of interesting is I ended up using this like digital waterproof thermometer pack on Amazon. I'll post a link. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like a standard thing that uses a digital communication to be able to send this data. You can hook something like 1,000 sensors up to a single COM port or something like that, or RxTX port. So, what I ended up doing with that is I ended up taking those and connecting them with duct tape to different points in my hydronic heating system so I could see when the oil was being run. Now, what's interesting is that when I hooked this up, I discovered that all the super smart controlling I was doing of my HVAC system in my house to try to save money, like warm during the day, cool at night, actually was pointless because the startup cycle was so aggressive in a cold house that I wasn't saving any money by keeping it cool at night. So that was kind of an interesting discovery. It also just kind of proved that like 90% of the stuff that I was working on was essentially pointless. All right, I want to talk about wins, losses, and takeaways. So wins, the button for the camera lighting is totally awesome stuff. The fully automated wood stove, except for loading it, is just absolute game changer for winter. MQTT, this is worth a whole other video. I do horrible, dirty things with Mosquito now. I've built a game server with it. I built a remote keylogger with it. I would probably put it in production for like a chat server. So it's just awesome. So I'm really glad I got exposure to that. The other thing too is I got comfortable managing really shit infrastructure. So I basically have like the worst infrastructure system you can think of, trying to manage all these Home Assistant, all these devices using Python, using Docker desktop on Mac OS. It's basically like the worst possible setup that you could imagine for managing something like this that's in production that you're using every day, right? And so it made me comfortable managing shit infrastructure, which also probably made me willing to host my own backend for a side project that I'm currently working on. So I've got a side project I'm working on now, and I have said no to Firebase. I've said no to Supabase. I've said no to AppWrite. I've said no to all of these things, and I've built a custom backend in Python with Fast API that has like a REST server, Postgres, ClickHouse, Redis integration. It handles authentication, it handles notifications, it handles website, has a distributed WebSocket system that I built, has all of these things that I've built that I was able to say no to these backend providers. And I was probably willing to do this because I had this experience running this shit infrastructure and I felt confident taking this on. Now, I want to talk about losses. So first of all, Python sucks and Home Assistant sucks. And so that was pretty terrible. And then obviously, everything else we talked about, a lot of stuff that I ended up spending a lot of time on ended up being worthless in the end. But there were definitely some very strong wins. So takeaways. I think everyone should do a Home Assistant project and be willing to let it rot until it falls apart and dies, and you can rise from the ashes like a beautiful phoenix.